What do you call a life that looks stable from the outside and feels one emergency away from collapse on the inside? What do you call a family that earns too much to qualify for rescue, too much to be counted among the desperate, and yet not enough to breathe? Somewhere before sunrise, in a kitchen lit by a single tired bulb, a lunchbox is being packed. Coffee is dripping into a chipped mug. A parent is checking the bank balance before the children wake up. The number on the screen is not catastrophic. That is almost the cruelest part. It is not disaster. It is simply too small to absorb what life might ask next. A rent increase, a cavity, a transmission failure, a fever that turns into a missed shift that turns into a late payment that turns into a phone call not answered, then another. This is not the theatre of sudden ruin. This is something quieter, something more modern, a life of constant calculation, a life where responsibility no longer feels like a path upward, but like a machine you must keep feeding just to remain where you are. And that is the riddle at the heart of our time. We were told that adulthood would be difficult, yes, but legible. Study hard, work steadily, build credit, save what you can, delay indulgence, buy the house when you're ready, raise your children with care, do the sensible thing year after year, and eventually the future would begin to feel like a room you could stand up in. But for millions of people, that room never arrives. Instead, there is a hallway, narrow, expensive, and endlessly extending ahead. By 2023, only 51% of Americans lived in middle-class households, down from 61% in 1971. And the share of national household income going to the middle class had fallen from 62% in 1970 to 43% in 2022. But even that statistic hides a deeper and more unsettling truth. The middle did not simply fall, it fractured. Some households climbed into the upper tier. Others slipped downward. The centre thinned out. And in that thinning, something essential changed. The middle class stopped feeling like a destination and started feeling like a balancing act. To understand how we arrived here, we have to return to an older promise, to a moment when the phrase middle class carried a kind of moral confidence. After the trauma of the Great Depression, after war and rationing and global fire, the United States entered an era that, in memory at least, glows with certainty. Home ownership had dropped to 44% in 1940. By 1960, it had climbed above 60%. Wages rose. Productivity rose. A single paycheck could, in many cases, support a family, buy a modest home, and leave enough at the end of the month to imagine a future larger than the present. The middle class became more than an income category. It became the emotional centre of the democratic story. It was proof, or seemed to be proof, that ordinary people could build durable lives through ordinary effort, that security did not belong only to aristocrats, heirs, or tycoons. That stability could be mass-produced. But history, when examined closely, always resists nostalgia. Even that celebrated post-war bargain came with exclusions buried beneath the floorboards. The same housing system that opened doors for millions also locked many others out. Federal housing policy helped fuel suburbia and expand home ownership, but it also institutionalized redlining and segregation. Entire communities, especially black communities, were denied access to the very wealth-building ladder that later generations would describe as the normal middle-class path. So when people look back and say there was a time when one job could buy a home and raise a family, they are not entirely wrong, but they are often remembering a world selectively edited. The old middle-class promise was real, yes, but it was never universal. Some families inherited stability because others were deliberately denied entry into it. That matters, because the inequalities of the present are not floating freely in time. They are rooted in decisions made decades ago, in maps, in lending rules, in neighbourhoods designed to appreciate for some and decay for others. Still, for a long time, the centre held. Work and reward moved together closely enough that the bargain felt plausible. Then, gradually, and then all at once, the machinery changed. Beginning in the late 1970s, the bond between what workers produced and what typical workers were paid began to loosen and then to break. Before 1979, productivity and pay largely rose together. Since 1979, productivity has grown 8 times faster than typical worker pay. Think about what that means, not as an abstract chart, but as a lived sensation. It means the economy kept becoming more powerful, more efficient, more technologically astonishing, while the worker at the centre of the story did not feel a proportionate expansion in security. The nation got richer. The middle-class experience did not keep pace. It is one of the defining emotional dislocations of modern capitalism, to live inside a society of visible abundance while feeling your own life becoming tighter, narrower, more brittle. Part of this was technological, part of it was global, part of it was political. The kinds of jobs that had once anchored the middle, stable, decently paid, often unionised, often built around middle-skilled labour, began to erode under the pressure of automation, outsourcing, deregulation, and changing corporate priorities. Warehouses filled with software. Factories hollowed out. Clerical work was digitised. Efficiency increased, but bargaining power weakened. Union membership among wage and salary workers fell from 20.1% in 1983 to just 10.0% in 2025. And once that institutional muscle weakened, growth no longer translated upward through the body of society in the same way. A larger share of the gains remained concentrated at the top. The ladder did not disappear, it simply became steeper, more fragile, and far less forgiving if you missed a rung. What makes this story especially painful is that the middle did not stop trying. It adapted, it stretched, it reorganised itself around the new demands. In fact, one of the least acknowledged truths of the past 40 years is that middle-class stability was preserved, in part, by asking families to work more, not just individually, but collectively. Women's rising participation in the labour market did not merely expand freedom and economic agency, though it certainly did that as well. It also became one of the hidden supports propping up household income. Researchers have shown that without the increase in women's earnings and working hours, real income growth for the middle class over recent decades would have been almost flat. The average middle-class couple now works about 600 more hours per year than a similar couple did in 1975. The share of dual-earning couples has risen from 50% to 70%. In other words, one of the reasons so many households appear to have held their ground is because they sold more of their time, more of their energy, more of their waking life to the market, just to maintain what one income once made imaginable. And yet even this adaptation had limits. From 1979 to 2018, average income after taxes and transfers rose about 53% for the middle 3 quintiles of US households. That sounds respectable until you place it beside the rest of the picture. 91% growth for the lowest quintile, helped in part by targeted transfers, and 120% growth for the highest, buoyed by capital income and top-heavy gains. The middle was not the biggest winner, and not the primary focus of protection. It was squeezed between 2 different political logics: relief for the bottom, reward for the top, and left to improvise in the centre. So yes, median household income did rise. In 2023, it reached $80,610, the first statistically significant increase since 2019. But income recovery is not the same thing as restored security, because somewhere along the way, the cost of being normal changed. That is where the trap becomes visible in full, not in luxury, not in extravagance, in the price of ordinary life. The place to begin is housing, because housing is not just one expense among others, it is the stage on which every other expense becomes manageable or impossible. A high housing cost does not merely reduce your bank balance, it compresses your choices, your timing, your fertility decisions, your job mobility, your stress level, your dignity. It invades the entire architecture of a life. By 2020, housing consumed 36% of annual expenditures for the typical middle-class household in the United States, up from 30% in 1985. Meanwhile, in 2022, half of all renter households, 22.4 million of them, were cost-burdened, spending more than 30% of income on rent and utilities. More than 12 million were severely burdened, spending over half. That is not a side problem. That is the central mechanism by which middle-class life becomes unstable while still looking outwardly intact. And for those hoping to escape rent by purchasing a home, the doorway has narrowed almost to a slit. In 2024, the median price of an existing single-family home reached $412,500, about 5 times median household income, far above the price-to-income ratios that were common in the 1990s. National home prices had risen roughly 60% since 2019. Existing home sales fell to their lowest level in 30 years. First-time buyers made up only 21% of home purchases, a record low, and the typical age of a first-time buyer rose to 40. 40. Pause on that for a moment, because it captures an entire generational rearrangement. The old script of adulthood imagined a first home as an early chapter, a foundation on which the rest of life could be built. Now for many, it has become a late achievement, if it arrives at all. The milestone did not vanish, it drifted out of reach, and with it went years of potential stability, savings, and psychological ease. Even renting, the supposed fallback, has become a tightening corridor. In the Federal Reserve's 2024 survey, renters reported a median monthly rent of $1,200, up from $1,100 the year before and $1,000 the year before that. Those are not just numbers, they are annual jolts, stacked one after another, in households where every recurring bill already has a name and a consequence. Ask renters why they remain renters, and the answers reveal the shape of the lock. 68% said they could not afford a down payment. 49% said they could not afford the monthly mortgage payment. 42% said they could not qualify for a mortgage at all. So the story we often tell, rent now, buy later, breaks down in practice. Later is no longer a time. It becomes a kind of mirage, always visible, never arriving. And then come the other bills, the bills that in another era might have been painful but not structurally destabilizing. Health insurance, childcare, education. The costs that now sit beside housing and transform middle-class budgeting into a permanent triage operation. In 2024, the average annual premium for employer-sponsored family health insurance reached $25,572, with workers paying an average of $6,296 themselves before deductibles, co-pays, medications, or surprise complications. Childcare for an infant in centre-based care averaged $15,827 a year. For a 4-year-old, it averaged $12,437. Think about that in emotional rather than statistical terms. For many families, bringing a child safely into the world now means taking on a second rent. And if parents want to secure the future through education, they often begin by financing that future with debt. Student loan balances stood at $1.66 trillion at the end of 2025. Entry into the middle class increasingly requires borrowing from the very future the middle class was once supposed to protect. This is why the public mood often seems disconnected from headline optimism. Inflation cools, we are told. The labour market remains resilient, we are told. Median incomes recover, we are told. And yet households still feel cornered. Why? Because what people experience is not only the official inflation rate, it is the cost of the dreams that matter most to them. A house, a move, a second child, a safer neighbourhood, a better school district, a refinance, a little room. The International Monetary Fund has pointed to a critical piece of this puzzle. Higher borrowing costs, especially for housing, created a disconnect between inflation statistics and consumer sentiment. So a family can hear that inflation is falling and still feel poorer because the thing they most need to purchase has become less attainable. The American Psychological Association found in 2024 that 73% of adults viewed the economy as a significant source of stress. That tells us something essential. The middle class trap is not merely financial. It is neurological. It is what happens when the future begins to feel adversarial. And the trap is not evenly distributed. It never was. Racial disparities in income, home ownership, and inherited wealth continue to shape who experiences insecurity most intensely. Black and Hispanic households are more likely than white and Asian households to live in lower income tiers. Home ownership rates remain lower for Black and Hispanic adults than for white adults. These are not isolated outcomes. They are the contemporary expression of an older architecture of exclusion. The historical denial of access to appreciating neighbourhoods, to mortgage credit, to asset accumulation did not disappear. It compounded. Generationally, quietly, persistently. So when we talk about the middle class shrinking or becoming precarious, we are not describing a uniformly shared fall from a once equal world. We are describing a system that widened the path for some, narrowed it for others, and now leaves many to navigate a landscape already tilted by history. Age, too, now behaves like a dividing line between economic universes. In the Federal Reserve's 2024 data, only 25% of adults aged 18 to 29 owned their home. Among adults 60 and older, the figure was 84%. Among households earning more than $100,000, home ownership stood at 85%. For those below $50,000, it was 35%. These numbers tell a story deeper than affordability. They describe a changing relationship to adulthood itself. Older households were more likely to enter the housing market before prices exploded and before interest rates turned mobility into a penalty. Younger households are trying to begin adult life at market prices designed by a previous era's asset inflation. That is why conversations between generations can feel so strangely strained. They are not simply disagreements about discipline or priorities, they are descriptions of different economic planets. And then there is the labour market itself, more flexible, more digitised, more efficient, more precarious, more productive, yet often less forgiving. Economists have pointed to forces that quietly reduce worker leverage, labour market concentration in certain industries and regions, non-compete clauses, occupational restrictions, worker misclassification, fragmented employment structures that make collective bargaining more difficult. Taken together, these forces produce a worker who is often more skilled, more monitored, more measurable, and less powerful. This matters because the middle class was never sustained by wages alone. It was sustained by bargaining power, the ability to negotiate hours, benefits, predictability, and a reasonable share of the value one helped create. Once that power erodes, the paycheck may continue to arrive, but its ability to anchor a life begins to fade. So let us step away from charts for a moment and enter a home. Imagine Maya and Daniel. They are not specific individuals, but neither are they fiction in any empty sense. They are composite figures drawn from millions of recognizable lives. Maya is a nurse. Daniel works in municipal planning. Together, they earn enough to be seen, statistically, as solidly middle class, perhaps even a little above the middle. Their friends might assume they are doing fine. Their social media suggests normalcy, birthday cakes, school concerts, a rented cabin once a year if they can manage it. But inside their month, the mathematics are relentless. Rent is substantial. Childcare reshapes every decision. Health insurance is deducted before their money even becomes theirs. One of them still carries student loan debt. Their car is older than they'd like, but reliable enough until it isn't. They are not choosing between caviar and thrift. They are choosing between continuity and risk. A dental bill might mean delaying a savings transfer. A school expense might mean carrying a balance a little longer. A sick child means rearranging shifts, and rearranging shifts means someone, somewhere, loses ground. This is the psychological genius of the trap. Maya and Daniel are not poor enough for the country to panic over them. They are not affluent enough to escape the cost structure bearing down on them. They exist in that large, invisible territory where suffering rarely looks dramatic enough to qualify as crisis, so they narrate it to themselves as adulthood. They postpone the second child. They delay the move to a better school district. They say the apartment is small but manageable. They call the cancelled vacation a sign of maturity. They say they are being prudent. They say everyone is stretched right now. They say it will get easier once this debt is gone, once the child is older, once rates come down, once the raise comes through, and perhaps sometimes it does, for a while. But the overall sensation remains the same. Their life is not collapsing. It is simply too expensive to trust. Now picture another household. Angela and Robert. Similar values, similar work ethic, not magnates, not members of some glittering elite, but they bought their home years earlier, before prices surged and before borrowing costs transformed the market. Their mortgage payment is manageable. The house has appreciated. Their housing cost is not a predator. It is a shield. The same economy that presses down on Maya and Daniel often works in Angela and Robert's favour. Rising home values enlarge their net worth. A fixed-rate mortgage insulates them from the violence of current borrowing costs. Their retirement account may rise when markets rise. They are not untouched by inflation or stress, but their relationship to uncertainty is fundamentally different. The system does not simply charge them for shelter each month. It rewards them for having entered earlier. And there, perhaps, is the deepest fracture in contemporary middle-class life. For some households, housing is a monthly extraction. For others, it is an accumulating asset. For some, wages are everything. For others, wages are only one layer beneath a structure of ownership already quietly working on their behalf. One family is renting stability from the future. The other is inheriting stability from the past. They may live on the same street, shop at the same grocery store, call themselves by the same class name, but the economy behaves differently around each of them. It is not simply that one has more and one has less. It is that one experiences the market as exposure, while the other experiences it, at least in part, as protection. This is where the central revelation begins to emerge. The middle-class trap is not simply a story of wages failing to keep up. It is a story of the very meaning of security changing beneath our feet. In the old model, work led to stability, and assets followed. You earned a living, bought a home, built savings, and slowly accumulated protection over time. In the emerging model, assets generate security first, and work often serves mainly to finance the chase. The person who already owns appreciating real estate, equities, or inherited resources lives inside a very different economic weather system than the person whose entire life depends on labour income and monthly cash flow. By the end of 2025, US household debt had reached $18.8 trillion, yet the ratio of household debt to disposable personal income remained near its lowest level since the late 1990s. At first glance, that seems contradictory. But it makes sense if you understand that averages are being cushioned by households whose balance sheets have been strengthened by asset appreciation, while new entrants, renters, and younger families absorb the raw pressure of the market without that buffer. Even mobility itself has been distorted by this split. A Federal Reserve study found that mortgage rate lock-in explained 44% of the drop in mortgage borrower mobility from 2021 to 2022. Think about the poetry of that phrase, locked in. Families who bought homes with low fixed rates are often reluctant to move because moving means surrendering an unusually favourable mortgage and stepping into a harsher market. Families who do not own are locked out by high prices, high rates, and stricter barriers. One group cannot easily leave, the other cannot easily enter. The housing market becomes not just a market, but a sorting mechanism. A society once organised around movement now finds itself divided between those protected by the past and those priced by the present. And when wealth rises, it rises unevenly. The Federal Reserve has noted that changes in household net worth are often driven by revaluations in corporate equities and real estate. Those are precisely the assets whose ownership is concentrated among higher income households and older entrants. So the modern economy can produce impressive gains in national wealth while leaving the core emotional experience of many working households unchanged, or worse. This is why so much public conversation feels haunted by mistrust. Growth is real. Wealth is real. Some balance sheets are genuinely stronger, but that success is not distributed through labour with the force it once was. The system rewards ownership faster than it rewards work. That is not a slogan. It is the structural heartbeat of the trap. And yet none of this is inevitable. That is important to say with clarity, because despair loves to disguise itself as realism. Housing shortages are not acts of nature. Childcare costs are not laws of physics. Health insurance premiums did not descend from the heavens engraved on stone tablets. The fragility of wage-based life is not some mystical condition of modernity. These are political, institutional, and social arrangements. They were made, which means they can be remade. The post-war expansion of the middle class was not a miracle. It was built through policy, public investment, labour institutions, mortgage systems, infrastructure, and educational access, however imperfectly. However unevenly. The question is not whether societies can shape the conditions under which ordinary people live. Of course they can. The question is whom those conditions are designed to protect and what kind of future they are trying to produce. Because in the end, this story is larger than inflation or housing or even class. It is about time, about generations, about whether the future still opens or merely arrives with a bill attached. Researchers at Opportunity Insights found that more than 90% of children born in the 1940s grew up to earn more than their parents. Today, only about half do, and the sharpest declines in that kind of upward mobility have happened in the middle. That should stop us, really stop us. Because the middle class has always been more than a rung on a ladder. It has been the place where a society proves to itself that effort and security can still recognise one another. When that place becomes unstable, something larger begins to tremble. Not only household budgets, but trust. Trust in institutions, trust in fairness, trust that the sacrifices of the present are buying something more than survival. So we arrive at the final image. Not a stock chart, not a politician at a podium, not a skyline glittering over luxury towers, a kitchen table, receipts spread out, a child asleep in the next room, an exhausted adult staring at numbers that are not disastrous, merely unforgiving, and somewhere else, another table, another family, another set of numbers softened by ownership, timing, inheritance, access. Same country, same flag, same speeches about opportunity. Two very different relationships to risk. That is the quiet drama of the age. The middle class did not simply become poorer, it became conditional. Conditional on when you entered the housing market, conditional on whether your family could help, conditional on whether your job came with benefits, conditional on whether illness, divorce, childcare, or geography arrived at the wrong moment. Conditional, in other words, on far more than effort alone. And maybe that is the question that should linger after everything else fades, after the graphs disappear, after the headlines move on, after the economists finish speaking. If stability depends less on how hard you work and more on what you already own, if security flows more readily to assets than to labour, if the ordinary disciplined life now feels like a high-wire act performed without applause, then what exactly are we calling the middle class? Is it still a broad social foundation? Or has it become a performance of normalcy maintained under pressure, a way of appearing secure while privately rehearsing contingency? Perhaps the trap is not only economic, perhaps it is narrative. We continue using an old name for a condition that has fundamentally changed, but names matter because they shape what we believe is happening. And what is happening is this: millions of people are not failing. They are navigating a system that has become astonishingly efficient at extracting composure from them while returning uncertainty. They are doing what was asked: working, planning, budgeting, delaying, enduring, and still the floor shifts beneath them. That should not be dismissed as whining, or weakness, or bad budgeting, or generational softness. It should be recognised for what it is, evidence that the contract between effort and security has thinned to transparency. So the final thought is not merely sorrowful, it is clarifying. A society can survive inequality for a long time. What it struggles to survive is the collapse of the believable middle, the collapse of the place where ordinary people are supposed to find a durable life. If that centre becomes a trap, then eventually the entire story a nation tells about itself begins to crack. And once people no longer believe that responsibility leads somewhere, they do not simply become poorer. They become untethered. So listen carefully to the silence beneath the numbers, because it is not empty. It is filled with postponed children, delayed homes, anxious commutes, skipped checkups, side hustles at midnight, careers chosen for insurance rather than meaning, marriages strained by budgets, sleep interrupted by calculation, and a generation learning to call insecurity normal because it has. Rarely known anything else. That is the sound of the middle-class trap. Not collapse, not yet. Something quieter, a long, intelligent, disciplined fatigue. And the question that remains, after everything, is as simple as it is devastating. In a society this wealthy, this productive, this technologically advanced, why does ordinary life feel so hard to hold? Until that question is answered honestly, the trap remains. And until the trap is named for what it is, millions of people will continue to stand in the narrowing space between comfort and fear, doing everything right, and wondering, in the privacy of their own exhausted minds, why it still doesn't feel like enough.